When Joanne and I first started researching works for the exhibition, one thing that we started seeing was that there was some connections in terms of themes in the work. And so what we ended up doing is basically kind of creating categories throughout the exhibition. Everyday life, memory and memoria, surrealism and fantasy, humor and play. Instead of separating them by folk art and contemporary art, it was bringing them together. The folk art and the contemporary art is dialoguing all throughout the space.
There's a great deal of hard analysis of life on the prairies from different points of view. Racism, residential schools, environmental crises, living through the Depression. But there's also a sense of joy and a real strength and such a deep sense of history.
This is a work by Jude Griebel, an Alberta contemporary artist. He creates these sort of surrealist-like characters, I guess that I would say have nod maybe to folk art, just in the playful and sort of crude way that he approaches them. But they do speak to more environmental issues of people's connection to the land, of sort of how we possess and take control of the environment. We wanted to include him, to represent an Alberta artist, but there's also really nice connections to some of the contemporary Saskatchewan artists as well, one being Heather Benning. For sure, there's great similarities in how both Jude and Heather approach their figures, and with little sort of nods to folk art.
The dollhouse was an abandoned farmhouse that was in Sinclair, Manitoba. I restored the interior of the house and left the exterior as it was, so that it lived like a tomb of a dollhouse, but a life-size dollhouse. It's a little 7-minute video of the house when it was well and existed, and then the fire takes it over, eventually consumes the house, and then the film finishes with the house sort of rising up again in the dusk. During my childhood, in our area, there was just so many houses that still had so much there. Like, it was like the family just got in the station wagon and drove away. And so I kind of wanted to, with that dollhouse, try and explain the story of what happened, that this family could no longer make it where they were, that the house became of so little value that they couldn't even sell it on necessarily, and that they just left. And what's the story behind that? Because we look at these houses like these skeletons of our past, and we think about this charming little house on the prairie idea, but really there's a reason why these houses are abandoned. There's a reason why nobody lives there. There's a reason why nobody could take them over. And a lot of that is like agribusiness. We all want so much more that we squeeze everyone else out. What kept calling me back to Saskatchewan, or to the prairies in general, was definitely the landscape and definitely the people. It's kind of what our family referred to as our home. And when your work reflects what you know best, and so many of your formative memories happen in certain locations, for me it was always a place of inspiration as well. And I wanted to talk about the prairies and talk about prairie issues and rural issues. I probably could have done it from away, but I think I wouldn't have reached an audience necessarily in Glasgow or in Halifax. They have their own set of history.
It's important to kind of bring this aspect of prairie art making to the fore and keep it fresh for viewers and for artists, because it really represents a strong sense of place and a sense of history, and it's a grounding in what it means to live in the prairies. And this understanding of the prairies and experience of the prairies is changing, of course, has been changing rapidly since the mid-20th century with the change in rural life.
Jerry Kaiser would probably be classified as a contemporary folk artist or vernacular artist. Jerry was untrained in the arts and actually started out as a furniture maker. He's actually known for not only his paintings, but his sculptures as well. And his work often can engage in sort of a social commentary. Cups littering the landscape here, commenting not only on the disposable consumer culture we have, but also just social commentary of life in an urban community. Prairie Gothic is sort of a contemporary art genre where the work speaks to sort of darker narratives and even stories of prairie tragedy. Sherry Farrell Rissette, Alan Benjamin Clark, and Ruth Cuthand, their works have been sort of recognized as maybe having an element of an Indigenous Prairie Gothic, as their work speaks to tragedies or colonialist history, to systemic racism, residential school. Sherry Farrell Rissette, her work talks about Saskatchewan history and locality. It references the Northwest Rebellion, and it's about Riel's dreams, and it actually takes some text from journals of his and incorporates it with the imagery that she's using. It gives an alternate view of history and includes an Indigenous voice of Saskatchewan history, which we thought was really important.
Folk art has often been seen as a sort of Western myth-making. It represents a settler vision a lot of the time. And so Indigenous artists' work included in the exhibition shows the other side of that. You know, what's Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba, rural life from an Indigenous perspective, both through the 1900s and right into today. What does it mean to be a Saskatchewan Indigenous artist, a Métis artist like Sherry Farrell Rissette, or a Siksika artist like Adrian Stimpson? How does their way of life relate to the life on the land that their ancestors and family had? So it's really important to our sense of understanding of where we've come from, what influences us, what assumptions we have, and also provides a way of celebrating that uniqueness as it continues to change.
Amelie Atkins, who's an artist from Saskatoon, she makes what I would sort of describe as contemporary prairie fairy tales. So she creates these storybook sort of narratives where there's elements that seem familiar from fairy tales. So like there'll be this woman who's dressed in red, and so you kind of associate her with like maybe Red Riding Hood. There's been a wolf character in her videos as well, but they definitely don't play out as you would expect. And there's sort of playful element to them. There's a little bit of sort of a dark side to them as well. Where they're shot, where they're set is definitely prairie. I think the contemporary art that's included in the exhibition really shows the diversity of art making in the province. There's sculpture, there's painting, there's video. So it kind of speaks to not only the diversity of art practice in Saskatchewan, but the fact that you can make contemporary art about being from here. Victor Teed was untrained in the visual arts, but actually started out as a furniture maker. You can see that he's heavily influenced by traditional Mennonite furniture making, so he's using sort of this chip carving approach that's very typical in some Mennonite furniture. Lots of humor in his work. His work gives nods to the funk art aesthetic and is known for depicting these little sort of vignettes of humorous scenes.
I think for most contemporary artists, it would be a mix of things that are coming from really intuitive and unconscious because they are part of their being, and then the more intellectual learning art history and understanding Saskatchewan culture.
Excerpts from conversations with myself had work that came from what was happening in the news or in the media. I mean, there were hundreds of paintings made in that series. I developed this style of working that was completely intuitive and allowed me to make a mark, respond to it, make another mark, respond to it. So I was able to really have a conversation with the painting. So my work really from that point on became, in a lot of ways, a collaboration or a collaborative event where the work would inform me as much as I was informing the work. My lens had changed. I mean, living in Montreal, living in Toronto was a very different experience, and I hadn't lived in Regina, I think, for probably 25 years. So coming back here was certainly a culture shock. One of the things that I noticed was how interesting local culture was, because I wasn't looking at it anymore through the eyes of somebody who grew up in Saskatchewan, but I was looking at it through this lens from someone who was away. Folk art, outsider art was something that was really influential to me. I loved that self-taught element. I think in a lot of my early work, I really rallied against a lot of formalism and really gravitated more towards work that demonstrated an intuitive process. I've been doing this for 30 years, so those influences have changed. But certainly starting with folk art, outsider artists, the funk movement was a big one for me because it was counterculture. It wasn't mainstream. It was a reaction to a lot of the work that was happening in the art capitals of the world, and I like that subversive approach. I like, I've always cheered for the underdog.
So many artists previous were wanting to do a New York story, but live and exist in the prairies, which made no sense. And because we were all embarrassed that we were like from these hokey little towns, and there's nothing to be ashamed about being from a hokey little town. So it can provide so much inspiration.
It's great to see that younger generations are embracing what they know. They're speaking to the life experience that they know and the culture that they come from, the place that they come from. I think that would be encouraging to emerging artists, just to let them know that the life experience that you've had so far, it's worthy of being addressed in contemporary art, that people are going to take an interest in that. If it's authentic and it speaks to people, they'll engage.
If you have program ideas that you'd like to see on Max TV Local On Demand, write us at max.local@sastel.com.